Hello again, witches, seekers, and friends, and welcome to the Fat Feminist Witch podcast, the show where we do a little ranting, raving, and wand waving. I'm your host, Paige Vanderbeck, and together we're going to explore magic and spirituality, social justice, the psychic realm, and truly modern witchcraft. Hello again, my witchy friends, and thank you for tuning in to this year's Fat Feminist Halloween special. If you're new to the show, every year around this time, I put out a special episode that examines some of the myths and legend that, throughout history, have formed the character of the Halloween witch in our favorite books and movies and costume shops. We're certainly living in an age that's much friendlier to witches, even the fictional ones. You know, good witches aren't the only ones that get to be beautiful anymore. Many use their powers for good, and even witches who outright worship the devil can still be the star of their own little teen scream drama. But that's a very new development in the story of the witch. For hundreds of years, witches were fearsome characters, usually women, who committed heinous crimes, but in reality, their crimes were living outside the bounds of what was deemed virtuous and good. They were unmarried, they had no kids, they lived alone. Maybe they worked with herbs and medicine, perhaps they were midwives. Many committed the crime of simply reading when that was illegal for women. Then we have all the other magical people. Hoodoo practitioners who were secretly following their African religions, even with the penalty of death hanging over their heads. In Haiti, voodoo practitioners were using zombification to enact community justice. And there are tons of believers in Mexico praying to the beautiful bones of Santa Muerte, or Saint Death, even while the church tries to stamp her out. These are what witches have actually done. But in our stories, what witches actually do is they make pacts for the devil. They sell their soul. They work with evil nighttime animals like witches or like cats and bats. They steal children. They sacrifice children. They eat children. They, mix up evil potions in their big cauldrons. These are the kinds of things that I wanted to find out. Where did we get that from? How did we get there? From people who were victims of the oppressive class to people who were in some way evil. And why did that persist into even the earlier days of this century? People still believed a lot of these things about witches, and unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the world, people still believe a lot of these things about anyone they decide is a witch. This year, we're going to talk about one of the most gruesome crimes that is connected to witches, and unfortunately to many indigenous cultures, often by their oppressors, but not always, which is sacrifice. Sacrifice is indeed a part of witchcraft, even modern witchcraft. But as is always the case, it's not exactly what we know from legends, stories, and even holy books. So let's talk about what sacrifice means to modern witches, and why the Halloween witches of years gone by were sacrificing everything from cows and chickens to virgins and babies. Sacrifice is a very old word with both spiritual and secular meanings. In either case, we usually mean it to say that we're giving something up for some higher purpose. We're donating money even though we're not rich. We are giving something away to help others who have less. That is a sacrifice we make for an ideal, for the good of others. Of course, someone could be motivated by guilt. They could be forced to give that money away. They could be trying to influence a situation, like they're buying something that shouldn't be bought. Or they could be exploiting someone's genuine need for their own ends. Like most things in life, sacrifice is neither all good nor all bad. In a spiritual context, making a sacrifice means you're giving something to a god or a spirit or an ancestor. This could be motivated just by devotion and love, or perhaps you need help and are offering something up as a trade. Maybe you're sharing your food to make them feel welcome in your life, or giving them a gift that they might have enjoyed in life if they were someone who had passed on, like in the case of ancestors. Again, these motivations can be corrupted, and you can be sacrificing something that doesn't belong to you, like the life of another living being, in exchange for something you aren't supposed to have, like unlimited power. One of the reasons we often use the word offerings these days is because we really connect the word sacrifice more with these darker, scarier meanings. It calls to mind, the satanic panic of the 1980s, which actually I learned this year began in Canada. I love my culture. Offerings in general sounds much less scary. We are not plunging a ceremonial dagger into the heart of a young woman who's chained to an altar in the woods. We're offering the gods some of our meal or flowers from the garden to welcome them in, to say thank you, to tell them we love them. It also has this vibe like, offerings, the gods accept an offering. They demand a sacrifice. So a sacrifice can be demanded of us, and an offering is something we give by choice. We have these terms like willing sacrifice, but that's almost always said with this tongue-in-cheek vibe of, but not really. So offerings is the more commonly used term, but it really boils down to the same thing. When you break the word sacrifice down to its original roots, its Latin roots, there is this secret third meaning to the word sacrifice, and that is to sanctify, to make sacred. A sacrifice to a god is not just given up. It is made sacred either through the act itself or in rituals that precede the sacrifice. Something given in sacrifice may be intuitively chosen, ritually washed, anointed with oil, placed on a sacred space like an altar or in the ground, or even destroyed to break it down to its basic elements, like when we throw something into a fire. When we do that, we acknowledge that the god does not exist on the same plane we do, therefore cannot use the actual item in its current physical form, but that they could potentially use the spiritual energy of the item. So we break it down to its parts, and we are still making this sacrifice to our deity or spirit. When you set up an altar, let's say, it's on a table in your home, you are forfeiting that table to this purpose. You probably won't use it for mundane things again. That's not always true. A lot of people have an altar in their kitchen that's just on the counter, but let's say you have a separate designated altar space. You make the table and that place in your home that it occupies sacred space. This is now a place where the material and the spiritual come together, where the gods or ancestors or universal energy can reach down and through it into your life, and you can send things through to them. It's a mail system. So if you think you've never made sacrifices or offerings in your spiritual practice, but you have a dedicated spiritual space in your home, or particular tools that you only use for magic, whatever, you have been doing that all along. The time and effort you put into creating those spaces and sanctifying those physical items is also a sacrifice, an offering. Even if you are a totally secular practitioner who doesn't worship deities or communicate with spirits or ancestors, that's what you're doing. But if you're making sacrifices and you don't worship anybody and you're not talking to anybody, who are those sacrifices for? If you've been listening to the show for any of the years I've been on, I think you would know the answer by now. The answer is you. The sacrifices, the offerings, they are for you. Even when they're for a deity, they are for you. When they're for an ancestor, they are for you. Whether or not you are doing this to ask for anything specific in return, that sacrifice is something you do for yourself. In his book, The Secrets of Greek Mysticism, George Lizzo says a widespread misconception about the ancient Greeks is that they had a transactional relationship with the gods, and the gods don't need prayers and offerings, we do. He says that the Greek gods are unchangeable, divine forces. They're not humans. They don't experience emotions the way we do, and they have no need for these physical items or food. And though it may be hard to hear, what we do here on Earth isn't really making much of a difference to them. You're not really changing how they work. That doesn't mean that they aren't real or that your practice or your belief isn't real. We just need to shift our perception of this idea. Many see this relationship as transactional. We give you a cow, you give us a fertile season down on the farm. I give you roses, you bring me a romantic partner. But it's a little bit more, it's a little bit bigger, a little bit more esoteric than that. It's more like I associate your energy with roses because they signify love and romance to me, and because for centuries they have been a part of your worship and mythology. So when I put roses on my altar, or I wear them as perfume, I am aligning myself with the energy of this goddess, which is the energy of love, and this will fill my life with love, which can lead to a new relationship. If that offering is for an ancestor or even the spirit of someone you knew in life, maybe you prepare a meal that they loved or that's from their culture, you are again aligning yourself with them and with their energy. You are communicating to them and to yourself that you understand them, that you are understood by them, and that you are thinking of them, that you are connected. You are triggering your own memories and emotions when you smell or make or eat the food. Now, this isn't how every culture or religion sees sacrifice or how they feel they interact with their deities and spirits. That was mainly how George Lizzo says the Greeks interacted with their gods, right? In many cultures, their deities do exist on a more physical plane. They are more closely physically tied to humanity, and therefore physical sacrifice works differently. In voodoo and hoodoo, you almost leave something directly related to your purpose in a sacred space. Like you leave coins at the entrance of a graveyard to pay your way in. Or maybe you offer rum to a spirit that really likes rum and avoid giving rum to the one who does not. In voodoo, the Loa also ride or inhabit their children, physically connecting with them, being in the same physical space as them. They enter the physical plane through those worshiping them, and their earthly wants become more literal. They want to drink that rum or smoke that cigar or dance to those drums because they love that shit. In Secrets of Santa Muerte, Cressida Stone lists all the things Santa Muerte likes to have on her altar. She likes sweets, tequila, cigar, or joints, what have you. She doesn't like sour things, so no lemons or limes should be left there. Though, personally, I have to believe that Santa Muerte would appreciate a really good margarita. She shares some anecdotal stories about people who incurred a little bit of wrath by either not making appropriate offerings, not keeping the altar clean or in the state that Santa Muerte would like, or by keeping something for themselves, like not sharing their joint or their tequila when they are there celebrating in her presence. But something to remember about Santa Muerte is that she is death. She is the spirit of death. She is tied to humanity, to the physical world, to the cycle of life. She exists on a plane that's closer to ours. She is a goddess for the people. It makes sense that these tangible things do pull a few more strings. Even if you're not wealthy, just keeping a glass of clean, fresh water on the altar can make her happy, as it's a sacrifice, but also shows that you are devoted to keeping up this relationship. You see her as a friend, not just a statue on a shelf. To me, this still isn't what I would call transactional, because my relationships with friends, family, other practitioners, whatever, that isn't transactional. We're not in a shop where I'm buying something. We are in a relationship that includes giving and receiving out of love and devotion and care. It is much more intimate than simply giving something up and getting something of relatively equal value. The end. To define sacrifice as a process of making a mundane object into a magical one, this works very well for me. I'm a very physical person. I love stuff. I'm very visual. I have lots of things. And the stuff that I use in my practice is very, very special to me. Even the piece of furniture I use as an altar is special. And before I used it as an altar, it was already special. It was a gift that I was given, and when I used it as furniture for non-magical items, it was still a very special piece in my home. Actually, every table I've used as an altar was important to me in some way before it was an altar, and perhaps that's why I chose it in the first place. That's interesting. I don't think I really noticed that before. But it is already an item. It's a place that raises energy for me, inside me. I have an emotional tie to it. It brings back memories. It connects me to someone or something or to my past and my life as a whole. When you hold something from my altar in your hands, you are not merely holding an object. You are holding a piece of me. For me to put something on my altar, to restrict its use to just this one purpose, and to consider it an important tool in my magic, is to sacrifice this piece of myself to my craft. It's not a one-time choice. It's a choice I make over and over again. I am routinely rededicating myself to myself as a witch and to magic when I use the item, as well as to whatever specific intention I am working on. When it comes to one-time or perishable offerings, my favorite is water. Water is life. Water is everything. Water is nourishing, healing, calming, invigorating. Cold, clear, clean water will never be refused by any spiritual entity or the universe, even if it just comes from your tap. I drink out of the tap. I'm very, very fortunate. I feel very fortunate that I can drink from the tap. But if cold water from the tap is what I use to nourish myself, to keep myself alive, then it is certainly good enough for my ancestors or my spirits. I am giving them something that means a lot to me and that I use to keep myself alive. If I never drank my tap water, if there was something wrong with it, if it wasn't something I could actually safely drink or put on my body, I would not offer it to any deities or spirits or ancestors or anything. But not all the water I offer is drinking water either. I have sleep apnea, and whenever I open a new bottle of the distilled water that I have to buy for the machine to use at night, I fill a cup on my altar first. This is a precious resource that I pay money for. And also I'm thanking the universe for this machine, which almost entirely eliminates the sleep apnea, which is dangerous and can damage your heart and your brain, apparently. It's super scary. So that is, I'm giving a little bit up because I am grateful that I even have the opportunity to heal myself with this. When I give water to the goddess Voluptus, it is usually either rose or orange blossom water, which I have in bottles that I buy just for her. I also have some in my kitchen. I buy the same kind for my kitchen that I do for Voluptus, but I buy bottles just for her. I offer it in a cup and also use it to clean her statue and the altar. I offer her flowers. This summer I grew hibiscus, and I've been cutting off flowers just for her. And I have to say, when there is only one hibiscus on that plant, and it is big, and it is beautiful, and it is vibrant, it is a tiny bit painful to cut it off and to bring it into my room, put it on my altar where no one but me is going to see it. I almost feel guilty. So her water, I look at it more like water for bathing or for perfume. It's something you feel with your skin, that you smell and that you see. It's water not just for survival, but for pleasure. Offerings and sacrifice are a time when intention really does matter. It's the thought that counts, it's the thought that counts when you're giving a gift. Now, if you're worshiping a deity and you want to leave offerings for them, you will have to do some research if you intend to go beyond water. As I said earlier, some deities and cultures have very specific types of offerings. If you don't feel it's important to research or ask the ways your deity wants to communicate with you, then you're not really that devoted, and maybe you shouldn't be doing this. The time and effort to research, this is also an offering to the deity. How to offer it to them is also significant for some. Leaving it on your altar for a certain length of time before disposing of it in the garbage or outside, if it's biodegradable, is fine. For deities of death, burying solid offerings or pouring libations like wine or milk or water onto the earth is more the way to go. On my altar, flowers go outside as soon as they close up or they start to wilt. The water never stays for more than a day because it gets stale. I only put food outside for animals to eat if it's safe for them to do so. For example, I use a lot of chocolate. I love chocolate. But that never gets tossed outside because dogs and cats can get sick. I don't really use a lot of meat for offerings, just it calls to mind animal sacrifice, which we're actually not going to talk a lot about today because it made me too sad. But if I did meat with bones, I would never leave that out. I don't want anyone to, like any animals, to choke on that. I also don't leave offerings in public spaces or in other people's yards. These are my offerings, and putting them out where other people can come across them, it seems like a scary thing to do to me, If someone came upon, a bunch of meat and bones discarded out in public, that could really freak them out. Something I read recently in a witchy book that had the alarm bells in my head going off is the idea of donating offerings to the homeless after you've made them, right? Because wasting food when there are so many hungry people in the world feels wrong. And while I love the sentiment, I love the beautiful thought that went into that, in practice, Do not do that. Please, for the love of God, don't do that. So first of all, most people who live in the streets are not going to eat anything homemade or unwrapped from strangers for safety reasons. I know you don't want to poison a human being, but the world is fucked up, and plenty of people out there do want to hurt homeless people. If they graciously accept the food, odds are they won't eat it. They're being polite. They're going to say thank you, they're going to take it, and they're going to dispose of it later. And now you're offering, it's wrapped up in this energy of fear and trepidation, which I'm sure is not what your deity wants, unless that really is their thing. Maybe you're worshiping the goddess of discord. I have no idea. But in general, that's probably not your intention. If you want to help people who are hungry, volunteer or donate, and just pour your spiritual energy of care and of hope into that. Bless the cans and boxes of food. Wear a symbol of your deity when you dish out soup, whatever it is. Food made for or shared with deities is not wasted. It is consumed. Once you've offered it, it is no longer yours to give away. And to get a little bit mean about it for a second, because it pisses me off, this should be common sense. We don't hand out homemade or unwrapped Halloween treats because we cannot verify the ingredients or the standards in the kitchen where they were made. If you don't take homemade cookies from a stranger for your kids on Halloween night, why should someone who is homeless take your homemade food? Now, this is not the only way that capitalism affects how we think about offerings and sacrifice. The bigger issue with capitalism, more than donating offerings to the homeless, because I don't actually think that happens a lot, the bigger issue is how we determine what is and isn't valuable. I think this is super common. When you're considering what you'd like to offer or sacrifice to a deity or a spirit, or to use in a spell or, whatever, it's common to think that it has to be something expensive, something you've bought. I've seen it recommended multiple times, or even stated as like an outright rule, that you have to buy, like spring water, for offerings. If you live where there's a spring, congrats. But for most of us, you have to buy the water. If you're offering perfume, it has to be some you've got to splurge for the Chanel. The rum has to be top shelf, whatever it is. This is because sacrifice is supposed to cost you something, right? This is a problem. What you're doing when you make claims like this is saying that the actual item that you're sacrificing, or the effort and the intention behind it, means less than the money that you're giving up to buy the thing. If this is the case, why not just put money on the altar? Some people do. Money is a common offering to lots of different deities and spirits, and that's totally great. But that is much more overt. It's much more upfront. It also makes it sound like a deity needs bottled water because it's cleaner and more potable. But y'all, they aren't drinking it. They're not drinking it. I am fortunate that I live in a place where tap water is something that I can, comfortably and happily drink. I'm a big water fan. But what I don't have here is an even half-decent recycling or waste management program. The list of things you cannot put in the recycling here is an absolute travesty. It's an embarrassment. It's disgusting. I feel guilty having to buy my distilled water, which I can really only get in big-ass plastic bottles, and I can't even get refills anywhere near where I am. Sending multiple big-ass bottles to the dump makes me feel guilty, even though I have to do it, right? Buying water in a plastic bottle you were not going to reuse just so that you can offer it to a deity doesn't sound right to me. What else am I sacrificing for this offering? I am sacrificing the good of the people around me, of the earth, and that's not mine to give. This is where we encounter the most important thing that we all need to know about sacrifice. You can only give what is yours. Maybe the water bottle example is a bit too small for you. So let's go crazy with it, Let's sacrifice something really big, like a life. There's a big difference between sacrificing your life and sacrificing the life of another. There's a lot of really fun context we're going to get into, but generally speaking, sacrificing your life for the good of others is what heroes do. And sacrificing an innocent life to get something you want or that you think everyone should want, that is what villains do. The blood inside that virgin strapped to the altar in the woods doesn't belong to you, and therefore it is not an appropriate sacrifice for any legitimate purpose. That's one out of about 1 billion reasons human sacrifice is no longer a regular part of any modern spiritual path. But was it ever really? The image of the Halloween witch is, and always has been, evil. She is a hag who is living outside the societal norms. She's worshiping the devil. She's sacrificing virgins and babies for magic or immortality or the ability to fly, whatever it is. The blood of infants, the entrails of animals, the immortal souls of virgins. These are all what we think of when we think of sacrifice. This is something people used to do for their gods, something we've grown and matured beyond. We have tons of historical evidence of human sacrifice and have learned from our mistakes. Right? As it turns out, by the time writing was invented, human sacrifice was already seen as kind of fucked up and taboo in a lot of ancient societies. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. But what also happened is that stories of human sacrifice were created to villainize cultures by those who were looking to oppress them or straight up wipe them out. One of the most well-known and hotly disputed cases of human sacrifice comes from the Bible and concerned an ancient people known as the Phoenicians. The Phoenician Empire occupied much of the Levant during, in the Mediterranean. This includes like Tunisia, Israel, Sicily, Turkey, parts of North Africa. It's believed that the Phoenicians and the Canaanites from the Bible are the same people, but please don't quote me on that. I'm not a biblical scholar. I've never even been Christian, so just a heads up. If I get something wrong, please feel free to tell me, but just know it's it's because I have not been educated on this from the get. Either way, in the Bible, when they speak of the Canaanites sacrificing infants to a demonic animal-headed god, these are the folks that they are talking about. The story goes that in the city of Carthage, the Phoenicians ritually sacrificed infants, boys mostly, to the god Baal and his wife Tanit in times of sickness or plague, as a way to ask for mercy. Parents would hand their child over to the priest, who would place the baby on the altar, cleanse and anoint them, and then kill them before putting them onto a sacrificial fire. I know that's gruesome, and I'm very sorry. The story also says that the blood was collected and used for future rituals or to sanctify the altar at that time. This story was written down, recorded, told by lots of ancient people, but none of them were Phoenician. None of them. These accounts all come from the Greeks, the Romans, and the Israelites, who all at one point or another went to war with the Phoenicians. Rome actually conquered Carthage later, and the entire empire was placed under Roman rule. The reason some still believe this is true is because in Carthage, archaeologists have found a small cemetery. It's called a tophet, which was filled with small urns that contained bones that most certainly belonged to infants, ranging from anywhere like 6 months to 5 years old. And the reason some scholars still don't believe these babies were sacrificed are also just as real. On any of these stones in the tophet, there's no mention of sacrifice. It doesn't specify anywhere. It's not on the urns, it's not on the stones, it's not anywhere. The detail about these sacrifices being made during times of plague also suggests that these children could have died from illness or even just natural causes. In the ancient Mediterranean, 7 out of 10 babies died in infancy, and of the remaining 3, only 1 reached adulthood. Ancient accounts specify that the Phoenicians only sacrificed boys, but DNA has proven that some of the bones belonged to girls. Now, sacrificing animals in times of plague to appease the gods or during special festivals to honor ancient gods, this was incredibly common throughout this part of the world. In this tophet, in the same urns as the bones of children, you find the bones of animals, mainly sheep and lambs. Some urns only contained animal remains, which unfortunately dispels the idea that the cemetery is just a cemetery for children who were taken too soon. Then there are some things that stand out in terms of how these ancient societies operated, their culture, and how gods were worshipped. Carthage was a massive city by ancient standards, well over 1,000 people, which was unusual. They were one of the most industrious people, too. They were the first to make fabric dye. Tyrian purple was all them. They invented the amphora. They created lots of glass works. They imported wine and cedar timber on a massive scale. They built ships and had a massive presence throughout the Mediterranean Sea and around the Levant. They built ships for other people. Like they would sell this like IKEA style, like build your own ship kit. You buy the kit from Carthage, it would be shipped out to you, and you would supply the labor to build it yourself. That's wild. I didn't know mass production was happening in the ancient world. That was such a cool fact to me. So why would a culture that was so industrious, that required so many workers, and where 1 out of every 10 children might grow up enough to be put to work, sacrifice hundreds of healthy babies? Then there are the gods to whom these children were given. Baal and his wife Tanit. Baal-Haman was the king of the gods and the patron of Carthage. He was responsible for the weather and agricultural fertility. Tanit was a goddess of wisdom and war, craft and civilization. She was the defender of homes and cities where she was worshipped. The fact that neither of these has anything to do with health kind of bugs me. But since they are the king and the queen, I guess that could explain why they would be, petitioned for help in times of disease. Another thing that really gets me is that the same Greeks and Romans, who were so horrified by this ritual child sacrifice, adopted these gods into their own civilizations. In Greece, Tanit was equated with Athena, one of the most beloved goddesses in all of Greek society. And in Rome, she was Juno, the goddess of marriage and families. While I can see the connections, their sacred domains kind of line up, why would you adopt a goddess who demands child sacrifice as the patron of your largest city of Athens and then proceed to, not sacrifice any babies to her? This seems like a big risk to take to me. Now, Baal lines up a little bit more because he was equated with Kronos, or Saturn, the father of Zeus, who ate his own children and then had to be cut open to free them, and then was imprisoned in Tartarus. Cronus is arguably a pretty villainous sounding character with a connection to baby eating, but that doesn't explain why Baal's wife wasn't given the same kind of horrific treatment, or why she was not associated with Rhea, who was Cronus's wife. After the Romans conquered Carthage, they actually built a temple to their own version of Tanit back home and didn't sacrifice any children there. That seems odd to me. Then we have the fact that this story plays out almost exactly the same later. But this time, it's the Israelites who are sacrificing their children through fire to an animal-headed god of their own. Moloch was supposedly a pagan god who demanded child sacrifice to gain power, and the people willingly complied in a way described as pretty gleeful and honestly gross. The moral of that story is that God, Yahweh, forbids passing your children through the fire of Moloch, as this would surely condemn their soul. If you put your faith in this one true God instead, not only will you be blessed, but you will also not be condemned. As we know, the God of the Christians and the Hebrews is known for having a pretty ironclad non-compete clause, no matter the reason. No matter the reason. And tons of stories in the Bible lead to that same moral of the story, where it's like, nope, can't worship anybody else, just me. Moloch was also supposedly a bull or cow-headed god, and not worshiping the golden calf was also a pretty big story in the time, There's also a translation issue with this story. Moloch doesn't read like the name of a deity in some of its earliest versions. It reads like a word. It could mean sacrifice in general. It could also be a type of ritual or sacrifice that was common at the time, which was the sacrifice of milk or milk-producing animals. The bit about not allowing your children to pass through the flames is also pretty ambiguous. Jumping through a fire or using fire as a symbolic ritual cleanser is a very, very old practice that's quite common all across the ancient world. Modern witches still leap over a Beltane fire in May to cleanse away certain energies or to bring them good luck. Jumping a flame or passing through the smoke is also used as a ritual, a rite of passage. In both the cases of the ancient Hebrew people and the Canaanites, this story of human sacrifice, unfortunately, was written by their detractors to paint them in a bad light, to convert adherents to this one religion or to justify their oppression. Sacrificing or murdering babies is actually still one of the most disturbing anti-Semitic, right-wing weirdo conspiracy beliefs that exist out there. That's why some super alt-right groups here in North America come up with stories about like baby eating happening at pizza parlors. It is tied directly to their rampant anti-Semitic Nazi bullshit. So how does that connect with witches? Many of the kind of classic witch imagery that we see at Halloween, pointed hats, the long crooked noses, and these Sabbath rituals, come from disgusting rumors and beliefs about Jewish people in Europe, that they had black polluted blood, that they worshipped their demonic deity in secret, and that they didn't conform to proper Christian society. The witch's black hat even looks like a conical hat that Jews were made to wear in the 13th century. And anyone accused of sorcery in Hungary was also made to wear these peaked Jew caps, as they were called, so they could be identified in public by others. The Jews were heretics, just like anyone else who didn't worship this one God in the very specific way that the church decided. The modern word for Wiccan holidays on our calendar is Sabbat, which definitely comes from Sabbath, the word for, the regular Jewish ritual. And Christian society made sure not to distinguish between this very regular, normal Jewish practice and the very sensational story of witches dancing with the devil in the dark wood under a full moon. So why do we think witches sacrifice babies? Because anti-Semites and other oppressive groups have been telling that same story to villainize anyone that they needed to for thousands of years. So does that mean human, or even, unfortunately, human infant sacrifice didn't happen in the ancient world? No. We know for a fact that there was some human sacrifice happening throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa during this time. But that particular story about the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and Moloch, that story has a lot of holes in it. Human sacrifice was actually practiced all around the world, which is so weird. It's so weird that that's like just an accepted fact. But by the Iron Age, which is like 1 million BCE, it was becoming much less common in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and was seen as kind of barbaric. Even back then, it was like, oh, that's something we used to do. The Phoenicians, for reference, were apparently ritually sacrificing their own children in droves as late as 800 BCE. Wild. But human sacrifice did still happen in some specific situations. Pharaoh's rulers and some big bad warriors could actually request what was called a container sacrifice, meaning that they were interred with their slaves, concubines, and wives, and other members of the household. They could be slaughtered and tossed in to the hole, the pyramid, the whatever, or they might have even been buried alive with them. Then we have practices such as headhunting and cannibalism during the act of war. Collecting the head or other body parts of a defeated enemy was actually very common in the Americas, Europe, Africa, Polynesia, Asia, all over the place. These parts were often displayed either to disgrace the enemy, to serve as a warning for others, or to balance the cosmological scale. It was, in essence, an act of dominance. In different Polynesian and Micronesian cultures, so in places like the Philippines, New Zealand, New Guinea, Indonesia, headhunting during warfare was not only common, like it was an actual established job. In the Philippines, they have their own beautiful practice of tattooing, much like other cultures in the Pacific. And headhunters had a very specific tattoo design on their chest that recorded how many heads they'd taken in battle. It was like pinning a medal to a soldier's chest. It is a marker of pride and of honor. In New Zealand, the Maori people created these beautiful facial tattoos called moko, which are incredibly intricate. There were styles for men that often covered a lot of the face or the whole face, while for women, they are mainly on the chin and the lips. The tattoos were symbols of status and they enhanced beauty, right? Not everyone could get one. This was not, you couldn't just walk on down to the tattoo parlor, hand them money, and get the moko. This is a sacred undertaking. And as such, they had to be selective about who deserved one. Each tattoo told a story about a person, about their life, about their achievements, and about their family. The moko connect people to their ancestors. So when someone with a moko died, their family could remove and preserve the skin of the head so that the tattoos and that family connection wouldn't be broken. These toy moko would often be kept in an ornate box and brought out during special or sacred occasions. This same process could also be used to preserve the heads of rival chiefs or warriors and used in negotiations, again, as a sign of dominance. Human sacrifice was most common in the Americas, and it continued over here until colonization, until Europe got here. Indigenous cultures like the Maya, the Mixtec, the Nahuatl or Aztec, the Inca, and even up here north, the Pawnee and the Mississippian, they all practice human sacrifice. For some, it was on a very large scale. For others, it was, once a year or for important festivals or occasions. The role of sacrifice, including human, in the ancient Nahuatl culture is really interesting and bloody. It truly was a part of everyday life. This is not actually that surprising, although it is shocking. It is shocking from where we sit now, right? But it's not surprising when you consider that in the mythology, the gods all sacrifice their bodies to create and to protect humans. We are actually the fifth iteration of humanity, according to the Nahuatl and the Maya. And we are successful now because the god of the underworld mixed his own blood and bones in with the remnants of all the iterations that had come and died before to make us strong. In Maya legend, a special gift for surviving, for becoming the successful iteration of humanity, the god of the underworld taught women how to harvest and ferment cacao pods and make the drink that we know as chocolate. In some versions of that story, cacao beans were actually part of the mixture that created us. It was bones, blood, human, and cacao. I love that because chocolate is the whole reason I'm alive, and this is proof. Part of my DNA. It's in all of our DNA. We're all here thanks to chocolate. So human sacrifice, both forced and voluntarily, it makes sense why this was a part of the culture, because if the gods are willing to give their bodies, their bones, their blood for us, shouldn't we be replying in kind? If we don't, what will happen? Or to us, to humanity, to the universe. By sacrificing those they defeated in battle, they are showing the gods how much they cherish the strength given to them. They are willing to fight for this life because it is precious. Self-sacrifice was the highest and most honorable act. In these cases, you could really see all the meanings. One is to give up something precious, and the other is to make sacred. Those people's spirits and bodies were made sacred through the act, and even when it wasn't a full sacrifice, giving blood was also practiced. Giving your blood to the gods, not only was it a very good sacrifice, it was a very powerful sacrifice, but it also kind of made your blood sacred in a way. You were touched by the gods. You were connected to them. Unfortunately, the story can get really rough, really gruesome. They did make child sacrifices to one god, the god of rain and fertility. They believed if they didn't do this, it would never rain, the crops would die, and then so would they. It's an awful story. What's interesting is the way that different indigenous American cultures, the way they treated the sacrifices, or should I say, the people to be sacrificed. We're not going to go into a ton of detail because it sucks and I kind of wish I hadn't read it. But said some had to be in pain at their time of death for the specific ritual to work. For others, nothing bad could happen to the person to be sacrificed beforehand. In Peru, they have found frozen, mummified bodies of young Inca girls who were sacrificed. And because they were preserved in the ice, they were able to test their blood, and see that it was full of coca, which is where cocaine comes from, and alcohol, which would have both numbed the pain and constricted the blood vessels so it would hasten their death by exposure to the cold. This was obviously an act of mercy. The children were also very healthy and well fed because those to be sacrificed were selected well in advance, sometimes years, and they lived like royalty until they were healthy and fat and sufficiently sacred. Some societies kept the remains of sacrifice and displayed them, either as a mark of honor or of shame. The Aztec or Nahuatl decorating scheme was big on skulls. Big on skulls. There was just skulls everywhere. I just want you to picture Mexico City, skulls in the walls, skulls everywhere. Even today, skulls and skeletons are very popular in Mexico. If you go to Mexico right now, you will still see skulls everywhere. The Day of the Dead is coming up right after Halloween, November 1st and 2nd, and you can find decorated sugar skulls, pan de muerto or sweetbreads shaped like bones, and fun little skeletal characters in art and decor. Santa Muerte, the spirit of death, is a really important folk saint. It may look like their culture is very focused on death, which seems scary, but those beautiful, smiling, colorful skulls and Santa Muerte, who is a loving maternal figure, to me, have always said that death is not to fear. You know, it's just another part of life. And it is something that we all have in common. It unites us. You also never really die in Mexico. Every year, the Day of the Dead, your family invites you over to share some treats and drinks and music with you at home or in the cemetery where you were laid to rest. That's love. Enough fun and art. Let's get back to human sacrifice. There is one other type of human sacrifice that I wanted to mention, mainly because it sort of ties in with a local legend here in the Windsor, Detroit area. In ancient Japan, China, and the Balkans, there are legends of people being buried alive in the structures of important buildings and bridges, castles, as a sacrifice to Shinto gods. These were often beautiful young women. Some of them might have been shrine maidens. Some of them might have been children. In China, Da Sheng Zhuang, the human pillar, was begun by Lu Ban, the patron god of builders, to set right the disturbance to the feng shui of an area that they created by digging and removing soil, by changing the landscape. The sacrifice was meant to appease not only the gods, but also the restless ghosts of those who had died unfairly and may inhabit the place. Legend has it, the same practice was used in the construction of bridges, with a young girl being interred, buried alive on one end, and a young boy on the other. In Korea, in the 1300s, a rumor spread throughout the city of Kaesong that the king planned to sacrifice dozens of infants by burying them alive in the foundation of the palace he was building. And the people of that city fled en masse without hesitation. In Japan, the human pillar is known as Hitobashira. And while legends of this practice persisted into the 16th century, there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence to prove that it actually happened, right? But the legends all specify that the ritual was used in construction near water to appease dangerous water gods. So bridges and dams and other, structures around there could be built. The Matsu Ohashi Bridge in Japan is famous for its legend of a human sacrifice. In fact, a nearby park is named Gensuke Park after the man who sacrificed his life to complete this really, really complicated project. Gensuke crossed the bridge and then was buried alive in the riverbed near the middle pillar where the current was the strongest. That bridge stood strong nearly 300 years after that. And Gensuke was never forgotten there. Though in the 1890s, when they were going to do construction to repair the bridge, everyone avoided the area lest they become the new sacrifice. Fortunately, it was not needed. In Serbia and Greece, there are folk songs and stories of sacrifices in the pillars of castles, and one bridge in particular. The architect of the Bridge of Arta was told by a talking bird, suspicious, that in order to complete it, he would have to sacrifice his wife. As she was being buried alive in one of the pillars, she was throwing out curses left and right that the bridge should be taken by the river as easy as a leaf and that those who cross it would be too. Then she remembered that her brother, a soldier, was abroad, and when he came home, he may have to cross the bridge. So she changed her curses to blessings, praying that the bridge stands strong as a mountain and that its passengers all cross safely. She was willing to give up her anger, to use this awful situation that she'd found in, to use her life energy to keep others safe. Here in Windsor, Ontario, and across the river in Detroit, Michigan, we have an urban legend that I just couldn't help but think of while reading these stories. And that's the story of Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was a labor union leader who mysteriously disappeared from Detroit in 1975. Hoffa had been a union activist basically his entire life. He was so passionate and approachable that even though he was young, he was invited to be the leader of the new union at the grocery store chain where he worked. He was bullied by management until he left in 1932, when he was invited to become an organizer with the local 299 Teamsters in Detroit. It fought for the rights of truck drivers and warehouse workers. Organized crime, the mob, had a lot of power all over the U.S. in the 1930s. And the mob had their hands in lots of pockets, but in this story, what's important is that they ran the trucking industry. So for Hoffa to do his job, he had to work with them. Being in bed with the mob comes with a lot of perks. And as the years went on, Hoffa got deeper and deeper. I'm sure he enjoyed a lot of perks, but he continued to work with unions and to protect the Teamsters from big business and from other shady unions. In the 50s, Hoffa started rising through the ranks and eventually became the president of the union. The mob provided him a gangster-ass chauffeur who later testified that Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most fearless and intimidating people he had ever met. This is when Jimmy's legal troubles began. He was charged with bribery, jury tampering, conspiracy, and fraud, and spent most of the 1960s in jail. Robert Kennedy, who had just become the Attorney General, really hated Jimmy Hoffa and was determined to nail his ass, which he did. Hoffa was sentenced to 13 years in jail. While in jail, he still tried to run the union through loyal supporters. But they started to distance themselves from Jimmy, and eventually he had to step down as the leader. In 1971, Richard Nixon, arguably the most ethical of all American presidents, commuted Hoffa's sentence. So Jimmy Hoffa tried to get back to work when he got out. Despite it being illegal, he wasn't allowed to be involved in any union activities. But Jimmy Hoffa doesn't back down. The mob did not like this at all. Jimmy Hoffa was way too obvious. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa had been asked to a meeting with both the head of the Detroit mob and the Genovese crime family out of New York, who are mob royalty. They asked to meet at a restaurant that he knew because it's where his son had gotten married, which is important a little bit later. Of course, the mobsters, they did not show up at the agreed-upon time. He was reportedly seen in the back of a big maroon Lincoln, 2 to 3 other guys, around 3 p.m., and was never seen again. To finally get around to my point, here is why I thought of the human pillar. There are tons of theories about the location of Jimmy Hoffa's body. In fact, it's kind of a long-running joke all around the states, but especially in the Midwest and New York. But if you ask any, blue-collar union guy around here, including my dad, who, and I'm not saying this means anything, but he is from an Italian truck driving family, so take from that what you will. Hoffa is either buried or maybe his ashes are interred in some concrete under the Renaissance Center, which was being built at the time. It's a real symbol of Detroit. If you have ever seen a picture or like an aerial shot in a movie of the Detroit skyline, made after 1977, you have seen the Renaissance Center, which is the large building, all of the columns right near the water. It's also right next to the tunnel. So when I go into Detroit, I come out right next to the Renaissance Center. I might be walking over Jimmy Hoffa's body. Maybe he's the reason why I make it safely to the other side. Maybe Jimmy Hoffa was not sacrificed to the gods, but he was sacrificed to protect an ideal and a power structure. He was sacrificed so that someone else could gain power, so that they could protect the status quo of Detroit industry, of the transportation industry, It made the mob more powerful, and not just in Detroit. Would I say that Hoffa is a totally innocent, totally wonderful person? I don't know, maybe not. But maybe I would. He dedicated his whole life to protecting, those salt-of-the-earth type union workers from exploitation. He fought for fair working conditions and for better pay so people could support their families, because that can be really, really hard around here. Jimmy Hoffa also had a family, including 2 kids. And who they grew up to be is quite interesting. His son, the one who got married at the restaurant where Jimmy Hoffa was supposed to meet the mobsters, grew up to become a union leader. He actually ran the Teamsters until very recently. He might still be the president, but I know he was running it still in 2020. And his daughter became a lawyer and then a judge who's known for being very fair and looking out for the little guy. Considering how often the mob threatened to kidnap, murder, take care of Jimmy Hoffa's children and family in an effort to silence him, maybe the end of Jimmy's life actually allowed the lives of his own children to continue. Maybe he wasn't just sacrificed for the mob to gain power. Maybe this sacrifice allowed his children to grow up to be good people, to put good things out into the world. Now, the Rensen is getting old, and one of these days, they're going to have to do some construction, some digging, and you better believe that every union worker in Windsor and Detroit will be right there waiting to finally put Jimmy Hoffa and his legend to rest in peace. So this Halloween, and in your magical practice going forward, I want you to think about what you sacrifice, what you offer, and why. What are you giving? What are you getting? And are you sure that everything you offer up is truly yours to give? Tonight, maybe you can also light a candle, or a million candles, for all of the people whose lives were taken to gain power, to protect ideals, to uphold oppressive structures. The people whose blood and bones and chocolate form the bedrock of some of our most sacred acts, our most sacred practices, our most sacred beliefs. Because if there is one common thread that unites the witches of the past and the present, reality and fiction, it's justice. Justice for the oppressed, the forgotten, the weird, and in my opinion, the wonderful. Happy Halloween, my witchy friends, and thank you so much for tuning in today, whenever that may be. It is always my pleasure to share my own magic and to celebrate this spooky and sacred holiday with the witches and the mystics of the world. I'm so grateful. So I hope you will join me here again on the next episode of the Fat Feminist Witch podcast. If you want to learn more about me and the show, if you want to buy copies of my books and get recommendations for new research material, books, decks, whatever it is, check out thefatfeministwitch.ca. I could not do the show at all without the support of my generous friends and followers over on Patreon. And if you want to pitch in and you can get some extra content like monthly magical newsletters and a witchy book club, and if you want to get, advanced knowledge or links to new episodes, visit patreon.com/thefatfeministwitch. I also have merch, tote bags, stickers, coffee cups, and of course t-shirts, which go up to size 5X, on my TeePublic shop. If you want to give a little bit, just one time, I also have a link where you can buy me a coffee. This is just a few dollars that you can send to support the show, to support me, and to keep me on the air. Finally, track me down on Facebook, Instagram, or Threads, where I can get a little bit more personal. I can interact with you guys, and I can make lots of jokes and share horrible memes. I mean, that's what we do there. I love that. So the links to all of these avenues of connection and support can be found down in the description box for this episode. Considering how often the mob threatened to kidnap, murder, take care of Jimmy Hoffa's children